Hey folks, good afternoon. Everybody well caffeinated? We doing okay? I'm Michael Weintraub. I'm a professor at Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, and this is joint work with Rob Blair, Manuel Moscoso, and Andres Vargas. So from the Philippines to Liberia to Colombia, states typically have a hard time reestablishing authority and legitimacy in areas that were once governed by rebel groups. I won't get into why exactly right now, but once a rebel group disarms, demobilizes, and starts to reincorporate into civilian life, there are governance gaps that emerge, right? So existing armed groups that are still kind of floating around or dissident groups of those that have just demobilized can then consolidate controls in places where these rebel groups once governed. This is just a very visual representation of this from a community in Panas, Tolima in Colombia. After a 2016 peace agreement, we just heard Natalia talk about this. A rebel splinter group in Colombia imposed in this community a curfew, measures to reduce noise in public spaces, threatened to impose the death penalty for drug consumers and sellers, thieves, and rapists. This is a very clear example of how a new or a reimagined armed group sought to reestablish authority in a place where the FARC once had territorial control. So the question that we're going to answer in this paper is how states can prevent armed groups from exploiting these local governance gaps in areas where former rebels ruled. And just to kind of let you zone out for the next 15 minutes or so, what I'm going to tell you about is a short, very low-cost intervention that was extremely successful in freezing out armed groups in areas where the FARC, in the case of Colombia, once ruled. And when I say short, I mean 10 hours per community. And when I say low cost, I mean roughly $1,000 per community. Okay? And I'll tell you exactly how we did that and why we think that's pretty exceptional. So this is a dispute resolution intervention. So lots of folks argue that dispute resolution is the most important component of local rule. And Arjona talks about it in this way: it decreases opportunities for criminal groups to become new de facto rulers in areas formerly ruled by rebels or paramilitaries. But unfortunately, the state is actually very poorly poised to do this in places where rebels once ruled. And basically, our argument here is that in weak states, the state needs to partner with local communities in order to provide dispute resolution services. So what are local communal institutions? These are embedded mechanisms for sustaining order independently of the state, and they abound. They're literally, I believe they're probably found in every state around the world. Here I'm talking about the shuras in Afghanistan, chiefs and secret societies in Liberia, clan houses in East Timor, and in our case, the Juntas de Acción Comunal, the HACs in Colombia. So these communal institutions have a bunch of advantages relative to state institutions. So they're literally of the community, and they've got really great access to information about what the local sources of disputes are, what socially acceptable solutions to them might be, and they enjoy local legitimacy that oftentimes the state lacks in these places. They also are pretty good, there's some evidence that they're pretty good at freezing out corruption and resource capture by local and national elites. But not everything is puppies and rainbows and ice cream cones, because these communal institutions can be co-opted by armed groups to facilitate rebel governance. They may make illiberal, undemocratic decisions that actually reinforce existing hierarchies of discrimination. And also, their decisions may be unenforceable without the threat of third-party enforcement, that is, either by the state or an armed group. And so what we try to do in this paper, in this experiment, is we try to kind of harness some of the potential complementarities between state institutions and what local communal institutions can do. And so we think that communal institutions may be best at adjudicating some nonviolent crimes, petty disputes, helping the state to get out from under a backlog of cases in the justice system. At the same time, the state can provide some of that coercive backing to the decisions made by communal institutions, facilitating enforcement. And this could also allow the state to gain a foothold in places where it's traditionally been very weak or outright absent. However, it's not easy to exploit these complementarities, and we've identified three things that any intervention trying to exploit these complementarities should try to overcome. The first is incomplete information. So state authorities don't know what they should be doing, communal institutions don't know what they should be doing, and the division of labor between them is oftentimes nebulous at best. Two, histories of distrust. right? So civil wars are contexts in which institutional actors don't trust one another. Citizens don't trust either communal institutions sometimes, or in particular state institutions. And this in particular, if communal institutions have been co-opted by rebels, the state is not necessarily going to be wary of those communal institutions. And finally, coordination problems. These institutions have traditionally developed in parallel to one another. And so even when interests are actually aligned, it's very hard to get them to work together. And so we're going to experimentally evaluate a program that we call Común Paz in Colombia, which is exactly designed to exploit these complementarities. We're going to work in 4 regions where communal institutions adapted to FARC rule. We've got a sample of 149 communities. Half of them are more or less randomly assigned to treatment. And these are places that have ongoing armed group presence, but no consolidated territorial control. The purpose of the intervention is not to unseat a local rebel group, but rather to prevent new rebel groups or armed criminal groups from taking over and consolidating control. Natalia already did a great job explaining Colombia. I won't take much time to do that here, only to say that the demobilization of the FARC left these governance gaps in really important ways that paramilitary successor groups, another rebel group, large rebel group, the ELN, and FARC dissidents are all kind of vying for newfound control over these places where the FARC once ruled. And it's also worth saying that the Colombian government approached us and asked us to do this, so there's quite a bit of political buy-in, at least at the national level. So what did we seek to do? We wanted to provide information about the comparative advantages of communal institutions, about state institutions. We wanted to build trust, putting people in the same room for the first time together and telling them everything's going to be okay, and how to work together to improve local dispute resolution. We wanted to improve the coordination. In particular, this is kind of the core of the intervention, by establishing and developing what we call dispute resolution response routes. And these are tailor-made for each community, figuring out who should resolve particular kinds of disputes first. If that fails, where they should go next. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But the goal of all of this is to obviate the need for armed groups to get involved in dispute resolution at the local level. Beautiful. I'm highly caffeinated, so I don't think I'll need those 5 minutes. So basically, the intervention consisted of 4 modules. The first, we worked only with state authorities. And so we played this game where they had to match responsibilities to actors. Okay? And the number of wrong responses was extraordinary. We did the same thing then with communal institutions. Again, tons of errors. And it's also worth saying the Colombian legal setup for dispute resolution leaves a lot of gray area. So there's quite a bit that's up to interpretation. Third, we put all these guys together, mostly guys, unfortunately, and they agreed on these tailor-made response routes to figure out who should be adjudicating what kinds of disputes and under what conditions. The only thing that we as researchers imposed is that there couldn't be something that is illegal. In other words, a communal institution could not adjudicate a homicide. That's simply not allowed under Colombian law. Okay? And then finally, once these response routes were established on a community-to-community basis, we involved community members, and in particular through an event, and then we posted these response routes in a very prominent place within each village. Okay? This is implemented by UNDP in collaboration with a Bogota-based NGO called CERAC. Pictures. These are the state authorities. You can see here, these are the communal authorities. This is a very incipient, rudimentary response route that was drawn up between the state institutions and the communal authorities. And here's a dissemination event featuring everybody, kind of telling them what the new status quo for dispute resolution would be at the local level. And this is the prettier version, the dolled-up version of a response route that was prominently displayed, normally at a kind of village store within treatment communities. How did we measure the effects of this program? So we applied an online survey to more than 2,500 residents, to more than 1,000 leaders, both from state institutions and from communal institutions. We had some costly behavioral measures, which I won't have time to talk about today, and then we used qualitative data from our facilitators and others. So I'm not going to show you any tables or graphs. I'm just going to tell you stuff. So Común Paz did a really good job at reducing the number of unresolved and violent disputes at the community level. This is very clear evidence that we improved the quality of dispute resolution at the local level. We also managed to decrease reliance on armed groups to basically zero in treatment communities, and we also diminished perceptions of armed groups among residents. Important to say, we were running up against what we call floor effect, so there was already very little reliance on armed groups and overwhelmingly negative perceptions of armed groups, but we reduced those things to basically zero. The program also improved perceptions of communal institutions among state authorities. Now state authorities were more likely to trust them, to reach out to them. We know that they were more likely to have the phone numbers of police officers in their phones, which is great. And perceptions of state authorities were also improved among residents. It seems like this is kind of state building 101, and it seems to have done the trick. We also improved coordination among both sets of authorities. So interestingly, despite this improved coordination and the cohesiveness of communal institutions in particular, we don't see an increase in reliance on either state or communal institutions, and we also don't see an increased reliance on armed groups for dispute resolution. So what's going on? Basically, we think, and we have qualitative evidence and some survey evidence to suggest that we actually helped residents avoid problems in the first place. So disputes never rose to be disputes because there was some self-regulation of behaviors that might have pissed off a neighbor in a control community that never came to be in a treatment community. Boom, conclusion. So states aren't very good at reestablishing authority after demobilization of rebels, right? Especially in places where there's been deep territorial control and socialization by armed groups during the conflict period. We think that these complementarities between communal institutions and state institutions are really important, can be exploited, should be exploited. It's very cheap to do so. It doesn't require a lot of time, and it doesn't require a lot of money. And we have evidence here that this actually produced benefits in terms of local dispute resolution and in terms of freezing out armed groups who may have taken advantage of these governance gaps to deepen territorial control. And we think that relative to existing alternatives, this is far less expensive, far less risky, and we've got an RCT to show that it works. Thanks.
This project is about how exile shapes online opposition, and I focus mainly on Venezuela. And it's actually, I think, fits really well with some of the discussions that we've already had about the role of particularly local voices in setting policy, setting the policy and setting agendas. By asking this question of who holds the mic, right? Like who are the people that are setting these policies? How do they align across groups? And in particular, you know, we already know intuitively about the presence of a pretty elite bias in the sense that we know that we tend to hear that the loudest voices tend to be elites in most conflict-affected countries. And what I'm going to show is that there's this additional layer in particularly repressive environments where when people are forced out for political reasons, it polarizes the opposition, that it effectively creates bigger divides between the opposition who leave and the opposition who stay. And because, you know, we naturally tend to focus on a kind of convenient sample, right, of people who are nearby, in order to set policy, particularly internationally, this can create kind of gaps between local needs and the international focus on kind of what is needed. And so I focus on the case of Venezuela, and I'm going to open with a kind of exaggerated event, which was, so there was this Operation Gideon that happened a few years ago where about 60 exiled or refugee Venezuelans basically tried to coup Maduro on like a boat with they had no shoes. This was like very under-resourced. It was actually led by some exiled generals from the military, but they really, I guess they thought that this had a chance of success. They came in via raft, and obviously it did not end well for them. And this is clearly a very exaggerated case. It was called the Bay of Piglets at the time. But it does say something about how this kind of disconnection happens. And I think that Francisco Toro, who writes for the Caracas Chronicles, put it very well. Exile is an emotionally devastating experience that's well recognized. What not everyone grasps is that it's also a politically transformative one. The day politics forces you out of your home, a wedge is driven between you and the country you leave behind. So Venezuela, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is in the midst of kind of every possible crisis that you could have. It's in a humanitarian crisis where there are blackouts, there are medicine shortages, breakouts of very treatable diseases, lack of food, lack of clean water, lack of just basically everything that you could imagine. And at the same time, it's in a political crisis, right, between the Maduro regime, which is a highly repressive government, and an opposition that is increasingly fragmented within itself as well. So in the context of this, the Maduro regime has increasingly been kind of pushing opposition out of the country as a way of effectively fragmenting them and isolating them from one another. And so my co-author Alex Siegel and I wanted to understand how exile shaped opposition behavior, particularly online. And what we theorized was that exile kind of internationalizes activist audiences and networks, which makes sense, right? When you are pushed abroad, you exercise your political power via a very different set of networks. It removes the threat of physical repression, which means that there is going to be greater freedom to speak and greater kind of willingness to step out of the bounds of what the regime might want you to say. But it also kind of pulls activists away from the daily realities at home that they were being affected by very, very, very directly when they lived in Venezuela. And as a result of this, we argue that these experiences alter activist goals and strategies, including how they express opposition to the regime. And the result of this is this increased polarization that we see between those that leave and those that stay. In particular, we look at three different topic areas. So the first is that we find that exiles increasingly focus on interventionist or foreign-led solutions. So many of the calls that we've seen for heightened sanctions and military intervention, even in Venezuela, have come from those who live overseas. We're also seeing much more hardline criticism of the regime, a much greater focus on issues related to, say, the relationship between Maduro and drug trafficking networks or the role of Cuban intervention. And we also see a reduced emphasis on local grievances and local activism, so less discussion of the kind of very direct humanitarian needs and humanitarian crises that are affecting basically all parts of Venezuela. So to look at this, we looked at a sample of 357 activists, Venezuelan opposition activists with active Twitter accounts, 94 of whom were in exile. And then we scraped all information out from tweets basically between January 2013 and May 2020. And then we categorized different tweets into different subjects. Yes, this is a very famous photo of John Bolton basically holding a "Should we invade Venezuela?" paper. So our first category of foreign intervention focused on sanctions, military intervention, and diplomacy as possible approaches to solving the Venezuelan crisis. As an example tweet, military intervention by nationals supported by foreigners would not be a setback from the current situation. The setback would be to let criminals continue to exterminate our population and to only confront them with nonviolence. # liberty or nothing. So what do we see? So after activists leave the country, this shows the difference between basically the activists who leave and the activists who stay, starting in this month 0, so months since exile. What we see is a greater promotion of these kind of foreign-led, very interventionist policies. The second category that we looked at were these kind of harsh criticisms of the Maduro regime, and in particular, harsh criticisms related to narco-trafficking, related to fascism, Cuban-Russian influence, and in general, kind of greater discussion of repression. Now, all of these things are true, right? They in many ways very much have a lot of force behind them, especially obviously with repression, and there are links to narco-trafficking and fascism, but we took this as the more that the activists discussed these topics, we believed the more kind of aggressively that they were confronting the Maduro regime, and the more that they were kind of implicitly rejecting a kind of peaceful resolution. So as one example tweet, the ignorant marginalized are the raw material of the Chavista narco regime. The idiotic madness is the contribution of the Chavistas to the Madurista narco regime. And again, what we see is even more kind of quickly a much greater use of this particular type of kind of hardline language after leaving the country. And then we also looked at local grievances, which we thought were particularly important to focus on because it tells you something about where the focus lies in terms of the issues that the regime is creating, right? It's much more domestic, it's much more subnational, rather than these kind of broad, kind of more attention-grabbing issues around narco-trafficking and the like. So as an example tweet, because of years of abandonment by Hidrocentro 2011, today we Carabobeños live a tragedy, more than 20 days without water in our communities. Hashtag Carabobo without water. And here what we see is that exile decreases the discussion of local service provision pretty significantly. So they're much less likely to discuss issues related to shortages of basic needs, much less likely to discuss basically local communities. So why does this matter? So I've already kind of previewed this idea that we also need to think not only about having local voices be very present and very active in the discussions of policy solutions, we also need to think carefully about the local voices and what they bring to the table. So one kind of consequence of this, right, is that outside Venezuela, the exiled fringe carries by far the biggest megaphone in discussions about policy toward our country. Exiles play clearly an extremely crucial role in agenda setting that obviously should not be taken away. But by design, exile is meant to fracture the opposition and as a way to kind of disconnect them from each other. And so we also need to think very carefully about how to get local voices who can travel back and forth between Venezuela and the outside, and how to incorporate them much more into these policy discussions. So this research highlights the importance of international actors cultivating these local contacts. I think this is especially true when we talk about trying to set policy outside of Caracas. It's effectively a black box in many regions of what's going on the ground. And this also means lowering barriers for participation. There are a lot of restrictions set up about money transfers into Venezuela related to sanctions and about getting a visa to leave Venezuela, and thinking through how to kind of collectively incorporate more local voices much more directly, I think is really crucial, and this research shows the kind of very direct policy implications of that. So that's all for me, and I'll hand it over to Adam.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Lichtenheld. I'm the Executive Director of the Immigration Policy Lab at Stanford. So thanks to SIGA for allowing me to encroach on Berkeley territory. I'm going to take us out of Latin America, as much fun as it's been, to Iraq. And the study that I'm going to be talking about was actually conducted when I was on the research team at Mercy Corps. So I want to acknowledge my co-author, Saad Sadi, and others from the Mercy Corps Iraq team who made this research possible. So since the Iraqi government declared victory over ISIS, the Islamic State, ISIL, Daesh, pick your name, in 2017, the safe and sustainable return of the millions of people displaced during the ISIS conflict has been a domestic and international priority. And yet, 5 years later, over 1 million people remain displaced and have yet to return to their home areas. Now, we know that some barriers to return are humanitarian and economic, such as a lack of housing, infrastructure, services in areas of return, but others reflect the social divisions that have been both a contributor to and a consequence of years of armed conflict in Iraq. And in particular, there have been numerous reports that a lack of social acceptance or the willingness of individuals and communities to welcome and live alongside returnees has both discouraged people from returning and caused some to be redisplaced after attempting to go home. And so addressing this challenge is not just important for ending Iraq's displacement crisis, it's also important for promoting reconciliation and preventing future conflict. This lack of social acceptance has been a particular issue in Nineveh Governorate, which is one of the most diverse regions of Iraq, where local ethnic and religious minority communities were heavily persecuted by ISIS. And as a result, in various instances, these communities have resisted the return of members of the local Sunni Arab population, ISIS's primary constituency, who some perceive as being complicit in ISIS's crimes. So to better understand this issue, we surveyed over 500 Yazidi households from Sinjar district in Nineveh to explore the conditions under which people were more or less likely to accept returnees. Now, the Yazidis, Iraq's second largest religious minority, were, as many of you probably know, particularly targeted by ISIS and subjected to a campaign of mass killing and forced conversion that the UN has classified as genocide. So places like Sinjar present a particularly difficult and challenging context for achieving durable return and reintegration. So we thought it's important that we explore and understand these dynamics in this setting. So I want to talk about kind of two main findings that we have from this research. And the first relates to refugee or returnee characteristics and how that influences the likelihood of social acceptance, whereas the second focuses more on trying to understand what can improve the prospects of social acceptance. So first, we found that whether an individual stayed or lived under ISIS played a much greater role in people's willingness to accept them back into Sinjar than their ethnic or religious identity. And second, we found that invoking a sense of shared suffering through inclusive narratives of victimhood significantly increased the likelihood of social acceptance, particularly among Yazidi men. So for the first finding, we conducted an experiment where we described a hypothetical returnee to our survey respondents. And we randomly manipulated or varied key characteristics of that returnee to see whether it affected respondents' willingness to say they would accept them back into their communities. So we varied two things. First, whether the returnee was described as being Kurdish or a Sunni Arab. And second, whether the returnee was described as being a leaver, meaning that they left Sinjar immediately upon ISIS's incursion into the area, a stayer, meaning that they stayed and actually lived under ISIS rule before eventually fleeing much later on, or a collaborator, meaning that they not only stayed and lived under ISIS, but they actually worked for the group in the municipality or in some sort of local governance capacity. What we found was that respondents generally were much more comfortable with leavers than stayers returning to their communities, regardless of returnees' ethno-religious identity. So identity did have a small effect. Returnees or respondents were more likely to accept Kurds, as we would expect. Yazidis are ethnically Kurdish. Many of them, when they were displaced, sought sanctuary and received aid within the Kurdish region of Iraq. But the effect was much more moderate than their movement patterns, whether they had fled or not. And in fact, what was interesting is that the proportion of respondents who were comfortable with accepting a stayer back into their community was about on par with the proportion comfortable accepting a collaborator, someone who had actively collaborated with ISIS. And we also saw really important differences in social acceptance by gender, both in the gap between leavers and stayers, and also in general, as women were much less likely to be comfortable with returnees coming back, regardless of their profile. And I'll come back to this in a little bit. So I think what these results provide evidence of is what I call kind of guilt by location, which is this idea that people make inferences about people's loyalties and affiliations based on their movement patterns in war. And we didn't just have these kind of quantitative survey results, we collected a lot of qualitative evidence. I have some choice quotes. And it really kind of illustrates this logic. When we asked people why they responded the way that they did to the survey experiment, many expressed this sentiment that, because stayers didn't leave, they must have been ISIS supporters or accomplices. But if they fled, then they trusted them, they figured that they weren't. So fleeing or not could be perceived as, rightly or wrongly, a political act. So in addition to exploring the characteristics of returnees, we also wanted to understand what increased social acceptance or increased the prospect of social acceptance. So research has shown that even in intractable conflicts like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, fostering what social psychologists, I feel like we're talking a lot about social psychologists actually in this conversation, what they call inclusive perceptions of victimhood by imparting a sense of shared suffering can increase empathy and improve people's willingness to accept and reconcile with other groups. So we wanted to know whether promoting an inclusive victimhood narrative by reminding Yazidis about Sunnis' victimization under ISIS made them more likely to accept Sunni returnees. So we randomly assigned survey respondents into treatment and control groups. The control group received no prompt before being asked whether they thought Sunnis should be welcomed into their community and whether they would like having a Sunni as a neighbor. The treatment group, before being asked those questions, received a shared suffering prompt, just like your community, Sunnis suffered significantly under ISIS. A lot of them were displaced, a lot of them were killed, they lost their homes, and they've suffered tremendously, to kind of try to invoke that notion of kind of collective or shared suffering. And when we compared the treatment and control groups, we found that exposure to this shared suffering narrative had a significant effect on respondents' willingness to accept returnees, but only really among men. So promoting this inclusive perception of victimhood increased the rate of social acceptance from a third to over a half of male respondents, whereas among women, invoking shared suffering had a much weaker effect. Now, we don't know exactly why this is the case. There needs to be further research. We could posit that, again, there's been lots of studies that have kind of documented the trauma that Yazidi women and girls faced as a result of these kind of systematized policies of sexual slavery and sexual abuse that ISIS inflicted. But we would need to do more research in order to know for sure. In conclusion, first, the politics of displacement and populations in wartime can shape attitudes and social relations after conflict. And I think this really shows that we need to consider those dynamics when identifying barriers to and trying to secure durable solutions to displacement, including return. Second, this research suggests that even among a heavily persecuted population in a highly polarized environment, fostering inclusive perceptions of victimhood through narratives that emphasize both in-group and out-group suffering can improve people's willingness to accept out-group returnees. And I should say that such narratives need not create false equivalencies between the experiences of different groups, but they should still seek to highlight common experiences and, in this case, the extent to which many Iraqis suffered at the hands of ISIS. And finally, when it comes to designing interventions to overcome political and social barriers to return, I think this research does illustrate the importance of considering gender-specific obstacles and concerns requiring different types or potential different sequencing of interventions across key subsets of the population. So thank you for bearing with me in the slide mishap. Appreciate it.
Can we get Michael and Jane and Adam to stay up or come up and take the seats for a few questions? So let's take just a few questions before we move on to our panel. Yeah, right here.
Hi, this is a question for Michael. And so I'm interested in whether the sort of communal justice institutions that you worked with had any sort of made decisions that would go against social norms or international human rights things, or if that would be an issue. I'm thinking about places where I've worked in the Sahel where such institutions exist, but they tend to be Sharia law-based and very biased by gender and sometimes also ethnicity.
Do I answer right away?
Go ahead.
Thanks so much for the question. So no, we don't have evidence of that. We do know that these tend to be patriarchal, machista kind of institutions. But we don't have evidence, for example, that they went against Colombian law or international law. We have no evidence of that. It's a very simple answer.
I have a question for Adam. Thank you so much for the interesting presentation. If I'm understanding correctly, you showed that when you showed this suffering code for the participants, you had some more social acceptance, especially among men. And I know you said we don't know why that's the case, and I was wondering whether you have any qualitative plans to do some more work to understand this, and whether it could maybe that people are just telling you what, so to speak, we want to hear, and so maybe social desirability bias or something. Do you have any thoughts about that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the difference that we see in terms of acceptance is really gender specific. I mean, in terms of social desirability bias, I mean, we see a lot of people, I mean, I guess it depends on which way you think it would go. But I mean, we did see, I mean, a generally moderate level of social acceptance. I think even before kind of doing the priming experiment, it was like 25, 30%. It was lower, obviously, among women. I would think that social desirability bias would be operating in the opposite direction, particularly when you have researchers affiliated with a humanitarian organization working in these communities in which people, at least from my experience, working in these environments, there's incentive for people to say, yes, everything's great, give us more money so we can do more peace building or development activities, right? As opposed to, no, things are terrible and this is an intractable situation. So, I mean, we don't know that for sure, obviously, but I think that's, I guess, how I would think about and react to social desirability bias. In terms of additional research, you know, I think that this is something that I know Mercy Corps Iraq continues to not just be doing research around, but they're programming kind of around trying to kind of rebuild social cohesion, and I think very related to I know the research that it sounds like you're doing. And, you know, I've switched institutions and would love to continue doing research on that, but no, like, concrete plans as of now.
Let's see. Oh, right there, yeah. Go ahead.
A question about the Exile paper. Do you and your co-author have plans to expand that into other areas besides Venezuela? And is Twitter, I guess I have two questions. Is Twitter the platform that you would use, or the data sets from Twitter what you would use to gauge that? Or are you looking at other areas of activism online?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have current plans to expand this outside of Venezuela, in part because Venezuela offers this kind of unique access to basically social media data. You know, opposition activists are extremely present on Twitter, and that is fairly unique in repressive regimes, right? We often have much less availability of kind of social media and direct communication in that way. I certainly think that this question of the role that exiles play in the international system is really important, and a lot of my research explores kind of why people are exiled in the first place. But I right now, no plans, I guess, but I do think that the kind of question and the findings are applicable, at least to some other cases that we looked at.
For Adam, super interesting. We've been tracking kind of attitudes towards social acceptance in Northeast Nigeria since about 2015, and early on the attitudes were, I think, really similar to the levels that you're showing. But we've since all of those were in a period before people actually started returning, and so I'm kind of curious whether you have any sense of as people have been returning, whether those attitudes have changed, because what we've seen is that the attitudes have just skyrocketed in a positive direction since even a very small number of people returned, and there was kind of a proof of concept that people could safely return to the community and weren't an ongoing danger.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. We know that some return happened in these communities before we did the study. In terms of how much, like, we don't have fine-grained micro-level data on kind of return patterns. It would be really interesting, to your point, to go back and kind of, to the extent that there has been more return, particularly in this particular area, to see if you see these differences. And the same would go to looking beyond. I mean, we looked at one district, right? So, I mean, obviously, in terms of external validity, it would be interesting to look at other parts of Iraq where, I mean, we know that this has been an issue. I mean, there's been research in Anbar province that social acceptance, even within the Sunni community, has been kind of a challenge and a barrier to return. But yeah, it would be really interesting to do a follow-up study and see if you see kind of similar effects as what you're finding in Northeast Nigeria.
We have time for one more. Yeah, go ahead.
I had another question for Michael about the sort of the community dispute resolution mechanisms you're working with, and whether you saw like forum shopping that, you know, surely there's traditional mechanisms that, I don't know, there are churches and paralegal programs, NGO, you know, in many communities people have access to multiple different forums to resolve disputes, and I was wondering how that showed up.
Yeah, so this is actually one of the motivations for this project was to eliminate or limit forum shopping. And so we do see higher levels of forum shopping in control communities when compared to treatment communities, because basically what we're doing is we're canalizing, that's a word in Spanish. We are uniting different conflict dispute resolution mechanisms. And so we do see a decrease in like the number of institutions to which an individual goes to resolve a dispute. We do see that, yeah.
Okay. Another round of applause for our panelists.